Cassius, an Elysian Tail. The city of Willard, in uproar as a massive slave revolt has caused the city to enter an inferno. Throughout the chaos, a young warm-blood slave by the name of Sothos had fled from the city towards the mountains. Hungry and tired, he would collapse into the snow, unable to walk any further. A voice awoke him soon afterwards. He asked, "What is your name?" Sothos responded with a simple reply of his slave name. The voice then asked another question, "What is your warm-blood name?" He looked up at the man, barely managing to take his face out of the bitter snow. "Gaius. My name is Gaius." For almost the last 200 years, the Kingdom of Oblivion, the last remnant of the great Sintok Empire and the bastion of the Moonblood Kingdoms, has been enslaving the warm-blood race in all forms of labor, from mining to construction to engineering to warriors to even sex workers. The reliance of the warm-blood slave labor has become a necessity for the survival of the kingdom, as now many of the cities, especially towards the east, the slave population outnumber their masters 5-1. Not only this, political infighting between the royal family of Iris was commonplace, as many of the family members were constantly killing one another to become the rightful king. Decadence and luxury had become commonplace amongst the populace of the Moonbloods of the Kingdom of Oblivion. However, the Warmbloods lived in cramped, overpopulated slums, all living at the whims of their masters. Long ago, the Warmbloods once had their own kingdom and their own king. However, after fighting off the Sintok Empire for hundreds of years, the Warmblood Kingdom eventually fell, as its king, Elysian, would die in battle. The king would die without an heir, as his two sons, Flegel and Erwild, both died in battle as well. King Elysian's last child was a small female child named Mandalay, who had been captured by slavers years ago. A legend had been born that one day a savior would come from the line of Princess Mandalay and vanquish the Kingdom of Oblivion and free their people. That legend started to soon become reality in the year of 196 of the Fourth Era. A young warrior had raised a massive slave rebellion against the Kingdom of Oblivion. He soon crowned himself king of the Warmbloods and named himself Maximus. 2 more years of war would rage on, and soon fighting had come to a large border town trapped within the large hills and mountains, the city known as Willard. In the year 198 of the Fourth Era, a massive slave revolt had taken place after the master of the city ordered the closing of one of the coal mines, which ended in the deaths of nearly 1,000 warm-blood slave workers. Sensing a chance to take the city, King Maximus marched south with 500 troops to help relieve the city and rescue and free as many slaves as possible. One of these slaves being the long-lost descendant of King Elysian himself, a young man by the name of Gaius. King Maximus would take a liking to Gaius and begin to train him himself. Many Warmbloods were killed during the suppression of Willard in the months to come, including Gaius' father, Flegel. Around 3,000 Warmbloods were able to escape into the ranks of King Maximus, while another 2,000 fled into the wilderness of Falana. However, the death toll was still too heavy to be declared a victory, as over 10,000 Warmbloods had been killed during the fighting. The following months, King Maximus was able to score several small victories, liberating small villages and freeing slaves. However, not once he had taken a major city or strongpoint to truly weaken the Oblivion Kingdom. The pattern of fighting in small, surprise, and guerrilla warfare tactics would continue on for a few more years. In the year 200 of the Fourth Era, King Maximus would get his chance to strike a massive blow against the Kingdom of Oblivion. The Kingdom of Oblivion, Iris Vostel, had ordered for a recall of nearly half of the garrison force inside the city of Ethelfield to relieve a massive slave revolt towards the capital of Oblivion, the city of Villargo. This left the city of Ethelfield extremely defenseless against an attack against Maximus' advancement. King Maximus had a force of nearly 10,000 troops to prepare to take the city of Ethelfield. However, it would not be an easy fight. The city was still under occupation with nearly 5,000 Moonblood troops, massive city walls, and a large cannon capable of mass casualties. King Maximus then turned to another advantage. The city was naturally a Warmblood community, and the population had nearly over 30,000 Warmbloods inside. King Maximus was planning on cutting off the city's access to clean water and instigating a rebellion within the common people, and during the confusion of the revolt, King Maximus and his army would ride in and liberate the city from the Moonblood occupiers. In the summer of 200 of the 4th era, this plan was put through fruition. Maximus and his army were able to take the city's access to clean water with minimal casualties, and the Moonbloods, not risking a fight in the open field, waited behind their city walls. As the days began to pass, the reserve of water began to dwindle rapidly, and as the intense heat wave had set in, many civilians started to soon protesting against the Moonblood occupiers. However, most of the protests were put down very quickly and violently, leading to the death of more than 200 Warmblood civilians inside the first week of the siege. As the first week of the siege had come to a close, a messenger had been captured from the Kingdom of Oblivion. The message read that the large force of Moonblood forces were moving towards the city of Ethelfield to fight to remove King Maximus from the water station. The Moonblood force being led by the king's younger brother, Iris Valtiel. Maximus knew that the time was of the present. Maximus later during the night ordered a surprise attack of the city, and using a wave of archers, they set the arrows aflame and set fire to the city. Many of the men protested this action, even Gaius. However, King Maximus assured his men that it was for the greater good, even though that many of their own warm-blooded species would probably be killed. As the city would burn, the Moonblood occupiers would have no choice but to use what little water they had left to put out the fires. Otherwise, they would all burn. Another day would pass, and a massive rebellion would take place inside the city walls. King Maximus took this to the best of his opportunity to take the city. He marched his troops towards the side of the wall and attempted to scale it. However, just before the first men got up onto the walls, a cannonball fired onto the ladders, killing dozens of King Maximus' men. King Maximus temporarily retreated back to the water depot. As the day raged on, the rebellion inside the city could be seen outside the walls. Gaius pressured King Maximus into advancing again to take the city, but Maximus ordered his men to stay put until he was sure. Another day would pass, and then to the dead of night, King Maximus ordered his men to attack directly on the city gates. With almost no resistance, King Maximus was able to barge through the front gates, and with some minimal fighting between a few Moonbloods and King Maximus' army, in the early morning, the flag of Oblivion was taken down from the city of Ethelfield for the first time in nearly 200 years. Once again, there was heavy toll from this victory. King Maximus had only lost 80 men, but inside the city of Ethelfield, nearly 8,000 civilian warm-blooded people had been killed. King Maximus would later write massive amounts of propaganda on how the Moonbloods killed so many inside the city of Ethelfield. However, the casualties were the least of their worries, as Lord Iris Valtiel was coming to retake the city at any cost. King Maximus had to figure out a way to defend his city from an army of nearly 40,000 Moonbloods. King Maximus asked for civilian volunteers to recruit into his ranks. However, most of the population were either women or children. Before the battle would commence, King Maximus would have 4,900 troops and 8,000 volunteers, adding up to a total of 13,900 troops, all to fight against 40,000 well-trained Moonblood soldiers. If King Maximus wanted to hold this city and solidify himself as king of the Warmbloods, it would take careful planning and decisive fighting to take down an army more than twice his own size. King Maximus began by digging massive trenches around the city and filling the trenches with large amounts of thorn-covered bushes. Later, King Maximus ordered large vats of oil to the top of the walls, ready to be dropped below, and within moments the vats could be set ablaze and burn their enemies away. In the late summer of 200 of the 4th era, Lord Iris Valtiel arrived with an intense hatred, seeing a city that belonged to the Kingdom of Oblivion having foreign occupiers. The very thought that Warmbloods had control over one of his cities struck his mind with intense hatred. He ordered a massive assault on the front gate with only 2,000 men, underestimating King Maximus, believing this would be sufficient in taking back the city. However, as soon as the Moonbloods smashed into the front gates, they only found a massive barrage of arrows and cannon fire. Iris Valtiel would lose nearly 1,500 men that day. Iris Valtiel immediately began to dig in and prepare for a siege after the failed assault. Iris Valtiel waited nearly 2 fortnights before preparing for another assault, and in the middle of the night, Iris Valtiel ordered a full assault from all directions of the city walls. Lord Gaius himself was the one who warned of the incoming assault. Lord Gaius took control of the northern side of the wall, while a new recruit, Comwell and Flegel, took control of the east, and Lord Wedelberg, the warm-blooded mayor of the city, took the west. On the southern gate was controlled by King Maximus himself. As the Moonbloods came close to King Maximus, he ordered the release of his secret weapon. Within moments of the vats of oil being poured into the trenches, a match was lit and the Moonbloods below were set ablaze to a roaring fire. Thousands of them began to burn and had to retreat. Iris Valtiel regrouped his troops in front of the front gate, managing to smash open the front gate, while he ordered a small group of his troops to move onto the eastern and western walls. King Maximus moved his troops as quickly as possible to hold the Moonbloods at the front gate, while Flegel and Comwell and Mayor Windelberg and Gaius would fight off stragglers scaling the other walls. As the moon hit the center of the sky, finally the Moonbloods were able to break through the western part of the city walls after a massive assault, and turning the vats of oil onto the warm-blooded city of Ethelfield, causing the deaths of thousands of civilians, troops, and even the mayor of Ethelfield, Lord Windelberg himself. Gaius, being able to fight off the assault from the northern side, moved his troops to relieve the western side of the walls, while Flegel and Comwell moved their troops to the front of the gate. Gaius, in the heat of the battle, killed one of the leading commanders of the Moonblood in single combat, the general of Takchin. After this, most of the Moonblood troops assaulting the western wall fled. Gaius decided to scale his men outside the city walls and charged towards Iris Valtiel's vanguard party. Gaius, in an ambush with less than 100 men, charged into the vanguard's encampment and began to slaughter the unprepared troops, including Iris Valtiel himself. Later propaganda would write that Gaius killed Iris Valtiel in single combat in the dead of night. However, the reality was that Iris Valtiel was killed by a random civilian while he was relieving himself out in the woods. Gaius set the camp on fire, and immediately afterwards the Moonbloods began retreating from the city. When Gaius had returned to the city, he had learned that King Maximus was mortally wounded. And just before his passing, King Maximus told Gaius his true origin, that he was the long-lost descendant of their great king Aeliorat. The proof was the sword-shaped birthmark on his shoulder that had been passed down from every generation of his descendants of his bloodline. King Maximus would die a few days later from an agonizing pain, and King Gaius would rise from the battlefield and take up the mantle as the rightful king of the warm-blooded people. The battle ended with heavy losses on both sides, with the Warmbloods losing nearly 5,000 troops and nearly 2,000 civilians, and also the death of Mayor Windelberg and King Maximus. However, the losses for the Moonbloods were much more severe, with nearly 28,000 of the nearly 40,000 troops being killed, and the death of Iris Valtiel, the king's younger brother. The impact of this battle would send shockwaves throughout the lands of Oblivion, and caused many other Warmbloods to rise up against their slave masters, especially in the southern bordered city of Wheeler, Gaius' hometown. Later, in the fall of 200, a massive group of Warmbloods revolted against the Moonblood occupiers. Later, in the fall of 200 of the Fourth Era, inside the city of Wheeler, a massive group of Warmbloods revolted against their Moonblood occupiers and slaveholders. Unlike the last revolt 2 years ago that allowed King Gaius to escape his enslavement, and ended in the total Warmblood defeat, the rebelling Warmbloods were able to take up several key positions in various forts alongside the mountain slopes outside the city. King Gaius began to gather up his forces and march south to capture the city. Gaius' general advised him to head towards the north and take back their holy Warmblood city of Delkier, but Gaius persisted. Along the way, Gaius liberated several small villages and asked for any male Warmbloods of age to join the fight. In total, Gaius was able to gather another 5,000 men just on the march to Willard alone. Before arriving to the city of Willard, Gaius had nearly 15,000 troops ready to take back the city. The Moonblood forces were completely outmatched and outnumbered, with only less than 3,000 troops inside the city walls. Gaius would help support the Warmblood that had surrounded the city and cut off any access to it. Most of the Moonblood forces had fled from the battlefield or towards the city of Willard. However, one Moonblood commander refused to flee or surrender. The commander's name was Ridovas V, and his forces were encamped at the Melida River crossing just outside the city. Gaius knew he had to take this fortress before he could take his home city of Willard. Gaius began a siege and called for the movement of cannons to his position. In a few short days, the cannon equipment arrived, and Gaius ordered a barrage of cannon fire onto the fortress. As the hours passed, the fortress towers of the walls began to collapse, and many of the Moonbloods inside were killed from the collapsing building. In a last-ditch effort, the Moonblood commander, Ridovas V, had taken a shield wall position with his troops on the fortress bridge, now forcing Gaius into an ultimatum: either blow up the bridge, which would force him to go around the river, which would take weeks or months, or Gaius and his armies could face Ridovas V head straight on the tiny bridge, which would ultimately lead to mass casualties. Gaius opted for another option and had a small group of his most elite troops sail across the river and scale the walls of the fortress, take the fortress from inside, and cut off Ridovas, leaving them stranded on the bridge. Ridovas V knew that his men would soon die from exhaustion while being trapped on the bridge. So out of sheer spite, he and his men charged straight into the firing squad of Gaius' army. Ridovas was later martyred by the Moonbloods as a commander who never surrendered. While Ridovas and his entire troop was lost, Gaius only lost around 30 men. Gaius would push forward to the city of Willard, and within the day, they were outside the city walls. However, when Gaius arrived to the city, he only found corpses. Out of sheer spite, the Moonblood army had killed as many Moonblood civilians as possible before fleeing the city. Many of the Warmbloods were left mangled and torn across the city. Various groups within the city fought back against the Moonbloods and managed to survive. However, too many had been killed to be considered a victory. King Gaius, who had once been a slave in the city, held on to the hope that one day he would free his family from their bondage, only to come home to find his siblings and grandmother, Malay, had been brutally killed. However, throughout the travesty, Gaius would find some hope. He would find his sister Elaine on her deathbed inside the Moonblood governor's house. Apparently, during the last 2 years since Gaius had been away, she had been taken as a concubine and had given birth to a half-breed named Cassius. Gaius took in his sister's child and adopted him as his own, declaring Cassius his nephew as the heir to the kingdom of Warmgothia. Gaius' sister would later die the following day, and was laid to rest alongside her grandmother, father, great-grandmother, and 2 brothers. Gaius had now had an intense anger and hatred for the Moonbloods, in declaring absolutely no quarter and to the death of all Moonbloods on sight. After the following winter, in the year of 201, Gaius would set his sights on the jewel of the warm-blooded people, the holy city of Delciurn. However, to take the city would be Gaius' hardest fight yet. The city of Delciurn had massive staggering walls, and the Moonblood occupying force of nearly 20,000. Gaius, after taking both the cities of Ethelfield and Willard, was able to inspire more Warmbloods to rebel and join Gaius' army. Unlike the last battles, the Moonblood commanders had stayed behind the protection of their city walls, the commanding officer of the city being the son of the King of Oblivion and the heir to the throne, Iris Vol. Iris Vol deciding to meet Gaius out on the battlefield. The King of Oblivion, King Iris Vostel, demanded that his son, Iris Vol, return to the capital of Velargo at once, but looking to prove himself and his glory to the Kingdom of Oblivion, ignored his father's orders and opted to fight Gaius head-on. Before leaving the city, Iris Vol left 1,000 men inside the city to keep order while he was away fighting in the battlefield. Gaius had nearly 30,000 troops. However, more than half of them were still new recruits. while Iris Vol had nearly 19,000 and were properly trained soldiers. Gaius decided to take a gamble and not risk a clash between two massive armies. Gaius had set up a large ambush within the confines of a small hill passing and ordered 2,000 of his elite soldiers to sneak their way into the city of Delkiern, just like in the Battle of Medellay Crossing. As soon as Gaius arrived in the battlefield, he arrived with a group of only 3,000 men to make Iris Vol believe that Gaius was completely outnumbered. Gaius fled the battlefield to a hill crossing, and Iris Vol and his forces chased after him into the mountain pass. After Gaius lured Vol and his forces into a trap, Gaius released a signal flare, and immediately afterwards, cannon fire began to rain down onto Iris Vol and his forces, who were caught between the hill crossing. Gaius and his forces then fired arrows and guns from the slopes and hills, and when they ran out of ammunition, they charged down the slopes surrounding Iris Vol and his forces on all sides. Gaius would slaughter thousands of Moonbloods, as the Moonblood ranks completely fell apart. Iris Vol had no choice but to retreat his forces back through Gaius's army to the city of Delkiern. Iris Vol would lose nearly 10,000 men, while Gaius would lose less than 1,000. Gaius immediately ordered a full charge after them as they chased them all the way back to the city gates of Delkiern. When Iris Vol got back to the city gates and demanded them to be opened, he only found that the city had been taken by Gaius's commanders of Flegel and Comwheel. Immediately they opened fire down below on Iris Vol, and before they were able to retreat, Gaius and his forces had arrived at the city gates, pitting Iris Vol and his forces between Gaius's troops and the city gates, while Flegel and Comwheel fired arrows and cannons from the city walls. Gaius' troops pressed Iris Vol and his forces up against the city gates. In a last-ditch effort, Iris Vol attempted to smash through the city gates, to some mild success, but by the time the gate had collapsed, Iris Vol had died from suffocation from the mounds of corpses of his own men. The few remaining Moonbloods that made it into the city were then picked off by the Warmblood mayor Bartley and his own militia. The great Warmblood city of Delkiern had been liberated. 30,000 Moonblood troops lay dead at both the mountains and in front of the gates. King Gaius ordered that all the Moonblood corpses were to be beheaded and placed on spikes outside the city to show that Gaius was offering no quarter to the Moonblood people, while the head of Iris Vol was to be sent by a lone surviving Moonblood named Givargo back to the King of Oblivion inside the capital of Valargo. Since the beginning of King Maximus and his death, and the beginning of King Gaius's campaign, King Vostel had lost control over 3 major cities, Ethelfield, Wheelard, and now Delkiern, and now had lost over 65,000 troops. His brother at the Battle of Ethelfield, Iris Valtiel, and now his son and heir, Iris Vol, at the Battle of Delkiern. King Iris Vostel was now struck with grief with the loss of his son and brother, and realized soon many of his grandchildren would begin to squabble over who should be the heir of the Kingdom of Oblivion. King Vostel, out of no choice, sent a peace offering to Gaius, offering him to keep the cities of Ethelfield, Willard, and Delkiern, and in exchange for no more aggression towards the Kingdom of Oblivion. King Gaius would promptly refuse this offer. Gaius wrote back to King Vostel extreme demands for peace. Gaius demanded the other warm-blooded cities of Yilwar, Dweemor, and Falward, and the Moonblood city of Valkresh to be handed over to him, alongside the freedom of all Warmbloods, and to be recognized as the true sovereign king of Warmgothia. King Vostel would obviously refuse and prepared for another wave of forces to take down or at least contain King Gaius. For the time being, King Vostel would name his nephew Iris Velexor as his heir to the Oblivion throne. The war would rage on for a few more years until Gaius struck another massive blow against Iris Vostel in the year of 205 after taking the city of Valkresh. However, losses on both sides were very severe. With both sides beaten and broken after years of war, both King Vostel and King Gaius signed a white peace that would last until the year of 213 of the Fourth Era, and war would rage on once again. But for a time, there was peace, and most of the Warmbloods would declare Gaius as their king. Later, in 206 of the Fourth Era, Gaius would also declare himself king of Wormgothia. Over these years of somewhat uneasy peace, Gaius would be preparing to take the rest of his country back from the Moonblooded hands. He began a great campaign to purge any Moonblood still occupying his lands, especially from the Moonblood-built city of Valkresh, later renaming the city to Maximus in honor of their previous king in the year of 208 of the Fourth Era. Gaius also began to train extreme amounts of soldiers and build mass amounts of equipment, and also support any runaway warm-blooded slaves back to his home country. Gaius would also spend large amounts of time with his only remaining family member, his nephew, Cassius. Gaius would continue to hide the fact that he was a half-breed warmblood, and signed a law in the year of 210 that all half-breeds could be considered honorable Wormgothians as long as they swore fealty to the kingdom of Wormgothia and denounced any loyalty to the Moonblood race. Not only this, but they were only allowed to reproduce with other warmbloods, causing the eventual eradication of the Moonblood genetics. Meanwhile, across the border, the Kingdom of Oblivion was struggling to gather any sense of stability, as the kingdom was constantly under threats of rebellion warmblood slaves and political infighting between King Iris Vostel's grandchildren. King Vostel knew that peace would not last, and his kingdom was not prepared for war, and he believed that once he died, the kingdom would soon collapse. Fearing that he would be soon assassinated by one of his grandchildren, King Iris Vostel left the capital city of Belargo and secluded himself to a small cottage outside the city of Voldor, still enacting his orders through his most trusted subordinates and closest generals. In the year 213, Iris Velexor, heir to the Kingdom of Oblivion and nephew of King Velexor, alongside his own nephew, Iris Vegas, claimed the crown and forcefully took the capital of Belargo by force, and prepared for a force to invade the kingdom of Wormgothia. Iris Vegas took his forces of nearly 50,000 across the south and marched across the mountains of the open wilderness of Falana and captured Gaius' home city of Wheelard, while Iris Velexor with his army of nearly 50,000 would march an army towards the north and cut off Gaius' forces at the Battle of Twin Peaks, only for Gaius to take a key position at the top of a mountain and halt the advancement of the Moonblood army at the Battle of the Restless Rock. Within just a few short weeks, Iris Velexor and Iris Vegas had ended an 8-year-long peace agreement. Once King Iris Vostal had learned of his nephew and great-nephew's betrayal, he was immediately furious and declared them outlaws to the Kingdom of Oblivion. King Vostal would soon march north to face his nephew. Meanwhile, Gaius, after losing the Battle of Twin Peaks, and now holding his forces at the Restless Rock, had to quickly come up with a plan, as now the city of Wheelard was now under the control of Moonblood occupiers, and he was trapped in the north. Gaius and his two most trusted generals, Flegel and Comwheel, went out into the darkness of the night to scout out the enemy position, soon to realize that Gaius' nephew, Cassius, had followed him. At first, Gaius was furious with him for following him, but allowed him to stay. As they continued to scout, they noticed a large carriage pull up, believing it to be Iris Velexor inside. They planned to take the carriage and taking Iris Velexor as hostage. The carriage came up to a stop, and instead of Iris Velexor, it was a noble female Moonblood. Gaius surmised it was probably one of King Velexor's granddaughters, and decided to follow after her anyways and take her hostage. However, Cassius noticed a small group of soldiers walking hastily away from the carriage. Cassius, curious what these men were doing, followed after them. The soldiers arrived to a small pool, and one of them took off their helmets, revealing to be King Iris Vostel himself. Cassius, while spying over them, readied his bow and arrow, and while Iris Vostel was bathing, Cassius fired an arrow right through his chest, killing King Vostel almost instantly. Cassius, at the age of only 13, would also fight and kill 2 other well-trained Moonblood soldiers, and succeeded. Gaius, Flegel, and Comwheel, during their scuffle and attempting to take the carriage, would unfortunately cause the death of the female Moonblood noble, revealing to be Iris Velexor's sister and mother to Iris Vegas, Princess Edavale. She had come to convince her brother to return home and surrender to their uncle, King Iris Vostel, who was now floating in a pool of water with an arrow through his chest. Gaius had soon realized what had happened and that Cassius was missing. Gaius searched for his nephew, only to find him carrying the corpse of the King Vostel over his backside. Gaius decided to take this incident to his advantage and claimed that Iris Velexor had killed his uncle and sister to take control of the Oblivion crown. Within a few short days, civil war immediately erupted within the Kingdom of Oblivion. Learning of his uncle's death, Iris Velexor fled from the battlefield alongside his men back to the capital city of Belargo and declared himself King of Oblivion, later claiming the city of Voldor as well. Iris Vegas, after learning about the death of his mother, renounced being the heir to Iris Velexor and declaring himself King of Oblivion. Later, King Vostel's grandchildren all began to declare themselves king, starting with Iris Vampti, who would take the city of Ylwar and declare himself King of Oblivion. Iris Vale would take the city of Vordor and reluctantly declared himself neutral in the conflict. Iris Vamta would take the cities of Falward and Estrabol and declare himself King of Oblivion. Finally, Iris Veltir would take the city of Medel and declare himself King of Oblivion. 5 of Iris Vostel's relatives were declaring themselves as the rightful King of Oblivion, and only one remaining neutral. Gaius knew now that this was the best time to strike. Gaius immediately prepared his army to take back his home city of Willard once again. Unlike last time when Gaius took the city of Willard, his army was ill-prepared and mostly made up of militia. Now his army were full of well-trained veterans and advanced weaponry. Gaius had marched south with nearly 60,000 troops ready to take back what is rightfully his. However, by the time that he got there, he found that the city had been retaken by his local armies and militias inside the city. The city of Willard had proven that the Warmblood people would never submit to the enslavement rule of the Moonbloods once again. Iris Vegas had fled the country into the great wilderness of Falana. Later in the year of 214 of the Fourth Era, Gaius would later then help his nephew assassinate Iris Vampti and take the Warmblood city of Ylwar. While this had happened, Iris Velexor had killed his second cousin, Iris Veltir, and taken the city of Medel after the Battle of Bright Stars. The Oblivion Civil War only had 2 players left in the game. In the east, holding the Oblivion capital city of Velargo alongside the cities of Medel and Voldor, and Iris Vamta, who held the Warmgothian city of Falward and the Moonblood city of Estrabol, while once again Iris Vale was declaring himself neutral, and whoever won the civil war, he would then serve. Gaius realized that trying to continue a war over one city was pointless, so Gaius attempted to bring forth both parties to the negotiation table. Gaius offered to meet with both Iris Velexor and Iris Vamta to mediate a negotiation between them both. To his surprise, they both agreed. In the year of 217 of the Fourth Era, King Gaius, King Iris Velexor, and King Iris Vamta met outside the city of Estrabol, with 10 armed troops from each side. Negotiations were off course and were not going well, and not knowing that Cassius had taken an army himself and moved in to take the city of Estrabol, and was marching full speed ahead towards where the negotiation was taking place, Cassius fired a bow and arrow from over 500 meters away, and the arrow landed dead center in the forehead of one of Iris Velexor's generals. A fight immediately broke out, and Cassius would later kill both Iris Vamta and Iris Velexor in the fighting, leaving a massive power vacuum in the Kingdom of Oblivion, and the only one who could claim king was in the south inside the city of Vordor. Within just a few short months, General Gaius was able to capture the cities of Falward and Midal, and now was preparing to cross the Amar River and take the capital of the Oblivion Kingdom and the great city of Velargo, the once great capital of the mighty Sintak Empire, the empire that ruled the world. And within just a few short days, King Gaius would storm the city, demanding that the city be burned to the ground. A once mighty city that had stood at the cornerstone of the Moonblood civilization had been left to ashes. Gaius would still ultimately punish his nephew for going behind his back. Cassius was placed in a prison cell for 3 days with no food, and was quickly released. Meanwhile in the south, Iris Vale, the last king of Iris Vostel's grandchildren, had no choice but to declare himself king, and managed to occupy the city of Voldor before any of Gaius's army arrived, declaring himself King of Oblivion, and the only King of Oblivion. The end of Oblivion was drawing near, as the only 2 cities that were still standing were the cities of Vordor and Voldor. Gaius prepared for the last battles of the war to destroy the cities of Voldor and Vordor, gathering 100,000 Warmbloods in his army to purge the Moonbloods once and for all. Many Moonbloods began to flee into the cities of Voldor and Vordor, or even take their chances in the wilderness of Falana and risk being killed by the monsters in the great wilderness. In the year 219, Gaius began a siege on both cities of Voldor and Vordor, the first of which was the city of Voldor, leaving Vordor as the final stronghold. After months of fighting and attempting to bring down the walls of Vordor, eventually the city began to crumble. Cassius wrote a letter to Iris Vale to a challenge to fight him and two of his champions along his own, and to meet on the large mountaintop outside the city. Cassius did this so Gaius could attack the city without a commanding officer. Iris Vale accepted. Cassius, alongside Flegel and Comwheel, would fight against Iris Vale, Phantasma, and Rito Tavi. Comwheel would kill Rito Tavi before being killed by Iris Vale himself. Later during the fighting, Flegel would be thrown off the mountainside alongside Phantasma, leaving Prince Cassius and Iris Vale. Cassius would be able to make various injuries on Vale, including crippling his right hand and blinding his left eye with a blade. However, Iris Vale was able to clobber Cassius across the head with a large stone, leaving him with a concussion. Cassius, completely disoriented and confused, was no longer able to fight back, and Iris Vale managed to make a large laceration cut across Cassius' torso. Cassius then collapsed to the ground, and there Cassius laid unconscious and defenseless. Iris Vale prepared to deliver the final blow, but just before he did, he noticed Cassius' blue coat and silverish eyes. Realizing that Cassius was a half-blood, and a small tattoo on the right side of his arm, the mark of a slave. Iris Vale hesitated before looking down below to the city of Vordor, which had been left in flames. Iris dropped his sword and fell from the cliffs. Cassius was recovered the next morning and was sent to a small cottage outside the city of Delkiern to recover. Cassius would meet a nurse named Adelie, and soon fell in love and quickly got married after that. Adelie would soon give birth to a baby boy, later named Aeliorat. What was left of the Moonbloods in Morgothia all fled south into Falana as their only option, as all major strongholds of the Moonblood people were gone, and the Iris line was dead. Morgothia was free and could finally prosper. However, Cassius suggested that the campaign must continue further south to wipe out the last remnants of the Moonblood people. Otherwise, one day they may return and try to take control of their kingdom once again. King Gaius, after the year of 220 of the Fourth Era, declared for a new era in the calendar and the Fifth Era to begin, the Era of the Warmbloods. In the first year of the Fifth Era, King Gaius began a campaign south into the wild country of Falana. The first on the chopping block being the Grey Clan, the Moonblood clan that had left the Sintok Empire thousands of years ago to live a life of peace in the large volcanic mountains of Everdon. Gaius would continue this campaign of killing any Moonblood and Moonblood sympathizers in the wildlands of Falana. However, a great tragedy would strike King Gaius while during a raid of a village in Falana, the village of Zeppelin. While Cassius and his soldiers were killing any and all Moonblood and Moonblood sympathizers, Cassius was struck down by a single warm-blooded child named Jen. The news soon came to King Gaius, and he was soon hit with grief. His hatred towards the Moonbloods grew even stronger, and his onslaught continued. Later, the next year, an unknown warrior with an unknown identity would find himself alone in a forest and find the companionship of a Nimbat named Fidget and a talking sword named Ara. And the rest, well, you know the rest.